we're going into the actual substance of the Shiva.
If we take Shiva talks about, he describes the attention New Times as hokum. Okay. And I think that's a serious misreading. Okay. Because that implies, unless I misread him, suggests that 80s Britain was different from 60s or whatever it is. I mean, at that moment, George is saying, most of us of the left would describe the generally of the left in relation to the welfare state, where you for or against it, right? And that time, Stuart is saying, our understanding of what the welfare state is gone. There is no such thing anymore. It's disappearing while we watch. So we're going to have to reconfigure what we think, okay, we are in. That was his speech. I think Siva read him as saying something different. Siva read him as if he was offering a counter critique. He wasn't. I know both of them well enough to say that. And the other example I would give is that the campaigns Stuart is making at that time, involved in that, which are informing him at that time, are of a generation of young black youth who are coming out of art school, who are involved in the field of culture, right? Who didn't really use, they knew of the institute, but it wasn't the place for them. Right? They didn't connect in the day-to-day with the work of the institute. It's not because the institute was blind to them. It just doesn't. It wasn't speaking for them. There's also, I think, something to do with the argument. This is the period in which postmodernism was everywhere. Okay, something I've referred to at the time as postmodern souffle. Okay, some of us, yes, wanted to see the end of history in them as a major thing, into away from the vertical into the horizontal, right? And the New Times came in at exactly the same time. Most people read the New Times as if it was saying celebrate, as if it was a celebration, as if it was a kind of new doxa, as if it was saying postmodernism was all the vague. In fact, Stuart was pointing something completely different from that. Okay, completely different from. We can't accuse either Siva or Stuart or Siva, of our problems in reading him. Okay, and I think that was just not on, and it means that it meant that, and the humility that then takes place towards each other's, their individualized towards the end, unfortunately, was never captured in any writing as far as I'm aware. But I certainly know that they both lamented that they'd been read in a way in which they went. So I don't, in the light of because I had that lived experience, read those seminal essays in that way. I read them differently. I read them as an off-the-cuff exchange. I don't think Stuart had in mind a certain group of. He certainly is concerned about a certain group of black academics in their response to young black artists' work, like Isaac Julian's work or Jonah Comfra's work. And this was the time in which Passion of Remembrance came. This is the time in which Territories is done. This is the time when Handsworth Songs is done. These are young people, and these are the time in which autograph and photography stuff is done. A lot of creative, radical stuff is emerging. And at the time, they're just told off, accused of being avant-garde postmodernist. And Stuart waded in defense of that work. And that's what happened, okay? And I think now, in retrospect, when we now think the major contribution that group of young people who came into the field of cultural production, through access and FE and so on, to become international figureheads, it's been a major feast. Now we can talk about a spaces in which it might not be. I'm not saying this is revolution come, but it's certainly what Stuart was kind of saying. these are young folks. Stuart was not really engaging with black politics here, right? He was concerned with another question. He himself says so. Okay, he was in conversation with a particular moment of British Western culture and politics. He was saying so. He wasn't talking about Jamaica either, although Jamaica is very present in his soul. He wasn't talking about Africa at all, although he writes about. I mean, he certainly is a figure of importance at CND and anti-apartheid movements and so on. He's certainly involved in the housing debates that involve Notting Hill and so on, in the coastal movement and so on, when he was a supply teacher. His own activism is very much present in the formative period in which the Institute of Registration is there. So it's not that. I think some of us who read it, and I urge people to go back and revisit what it is, that essay. And I think it's it's not an essay that I enjoy reading. And I say to Siva myself that I think you got it wrong. And I'm lucky to have lived a time in which I was able. A lot of people would say that they were either thrown out or they were not allowed to come back to the institute. I never did have that kind of experience myself. I was loved. I mean, even at the height of the anti-Zimbabwe stories, the two luminaries who kept on saying hello were either John LaRose and Stuart. Ring me first thing in the moment, the minute I come off World Affairs, would say, "You got it right. Next time say this." And they came from a different kind of pages of a tradition. Okay. And that touch, that love, pedagogical solidarities. I had the joy of spending the last 20, 30 years of Stuart's life, seeing him every 4 or so weeks in a moment like this, in which he would share with me things that are everywhere. Now the stuff that is available on public stuff, I'd read it before. I know Don Colin personally, forever. I still do, okay? And I used to go to the institute every other day when I worked in Camden. But those institutions, it's interesting, the theory of institution matters, because without Ilya and Herman Ousley and occupants of the last days of the GOC, the resources to buy the institute would not have happened. Do you see what I mean? That's another interesting example of institutions. Sorry, it's a roundabout way of answering a question which is not, and I think it's exaggerated than what it really is. Yes, there was a bit of a rumble in the jungle, but not of the kind that most people think it's definitive.
If I could attempt to make a comment on this and get your response. For me, it seems that what Stuart Hall is identifying is new identities that people are adopting. That's happening in reality. So he's saying we need to grapple with this.
No, he's not saying that. He says these are new times, okay? When he talks about identities, he says identities are not fixed. The ones that you're given and the ones that I give you, they're always in flux. It's not pointing towards, most people think he's the godfather of identity politics. He isn't. He's simply saying we are facing new times historically, right? And that is not the same thing as saying there are new identities. The question of identity is not, it's just, of course he pays attention to it. Okay? He always says identities are shaped and formed by material conditions, right? Without any kind of definitive sense. But he's not saying they're new times because they're new identities. These are two parallel things. To collapse, that reductivism of collapsing as if they're saying the same, has been part of the problem, right? We are in new times now. This is not the same period as which Corbyn was, right? It's a new time, but what is that new time? And to understand that new time, you have to go back to what his use of the notion of conjuncture, okay, or the hegemonic. Okay, his use of that is a pointer towards new times. It's not a pointer towards new identities, whatever that means.
I understand, but is not part of his argument to say these are new times? That's fine. This is what it's producing. This is what's happening, and we need to understand it.
He's not saying that these new identities are produced by new times. No, these are things that we were blind to. right?
Okay, fine.
There is not saying, for example, these are new subjectivities. We now know that, there are gay people around the corner. No, we just have not never been attentive to them. And part of the reason not being attentive to is not recognizing the movement of history. The argument Stuart is making is about taking histories seriously
Understand.
and
So,
not being a supra history. The kind of
so is he arguing directly or indirectly? If we don't understand the new times, then the right wing
he says they do.
eats that up. Right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. He says they grab. That's what he says. The success of Thatcherism.
That's what I'm trying to get
Right.
at.
Was that it understood new times? The question is, what does it do with it?
Exactly. And
Right.
that's the problem of Shiva's response.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
Got you. Yeah.
That's the response. You see, the thing is, if we understood what's being played out, it's a mistake, Stuart says, to think the right do not think. It is the world in which they want to construct at your peril. That's what the last 400 years have been about, for Christ's sake. It's one thing to say the Anglo-American scenario is in serious rubbish, which it is. But it still poses a serious danger. It's not going to let go easily, because I've written a wonderful book. Do you know what I mean? And I think Stuart is pointing to new times, right? He gives examples of those new times that we now see on the political horizon, subjectivities that we didn't or had missed to recognize before. We have to speak through new times and offer an alternative that at least that enables us to live a humane way on our planet.
So looking back on the intermediary period, it seems whatever left of sort has failed to grapple with
they have not
every
read
successive
Stuart.
new time.
They have not read Stuart. That's the point I'm making. I think that's been a peculiar misreading of him. Okay, and there are some people who still surprise me. They think he was, they said, what, was he black? And I'm thinking, well, what the hell did you think he was? As if black thought, or as if black people are incapable of thinking in a way in which they do. Do you see what I mean? And that is strange way, okay, of not, most people think, oh, he was a structuralist. Stuart spends most of his life taking the piss out of it, sorry to say, of post-structuralism. He says, yes, take it seriously, yes, but don't buy into it, for God's sake.
So just slightly changing, you can continue commenting on what you like, of course, but so you referenced earlier in the conversation Professor Gus John, who conveys his warm greetings, by the way. You just mentioned John LaRose's name. So I wanted to talk about your interaction with that general community.
Those two.
Well, not just those two, but that
That moment.
the international Black and Radical Third World Book Fair.
There is Gus John. There is, of course, Anne Phoenix. There is Stella Dadzi. There is John LaRose. Two things about certainly my relationship with John, with Gus, yes, we both in a weird way went through the tunnel of a Jesuit experience. It's a bit like a trot, like once a trot will always be one, no matter what they become. There is always a bit of a trot. Well, in some ways, we approach notions of solitude in that way. We know the habits of the academy because once upon a time, we were made to go through the Jesuit experience. There's another tomb of work that could be written about that, okay? So we both have a glance at the wealth and we laugh, okay? It is the hook to the philosophical, and he's a teacher, yes? And we both teach, have taught, worked in the site of education as praxis, right? We were familiar with what sort of like continental theories of the time we were on about, but we never really kind of advocates. Grenada is important to him in the same way as Machel is to me. You know what I mean? Because they were lived moments of our life, like at the other end of the phone. It isn't something we discovered from going to the meeting somewhere. This is something you wake up in the middle of the night. It's happened to somebody you actually know, right? And John was that too, right? They were intellectuals. They lived an intellectual life.
John Rose.
Both John and Gus. On the theatres of knowing. With John Rose is the one who connects. Go back to the New Cross and the subsequent civil disorders that have gone on. He goes to the place of work from his histories as trade union. Out there, yes, on the plantation, back to here. He is closer to understanding the notion of the worker. He is one of the few people who there finds and begins to think, well, this, as Stuart picks it up, the concept of the breadwinner, the male construct of the breadwinner and all the masculinities that go with it begins to make both of them uncomfortable as a site of unpicking. Right? I was lucky to have been around those. Right? They, in their own way, were also leading the solidarity networks that sustained people like myself in ZANU, in Frelimo, in ZIPRA, in the NC, in the MPLA. Our friendships were formed in those, whether we bumped into at the Keskidi Center or in Bricks and maybe on a drive going to Bristol like United. They were formed in those afterlives. Our families were formed in those afterlives. Sometimes the difficulties of bringing up families we experience were because these were in those kinds of encounters in which one became the things in attachment theory, the things that attached us together were the pleasures and the joys brought together by those solidarities. So I am part of that period. I'm younger part of the same intellectual generation. They would be the first point of call. What's happening in Stroud Green or what's happening in Manchester? So it's not surprising by tortuous route. At some point, Gus became my boss in Ilya. Nobody else would have given me that job. Do you know what I mean? Those were the real material conditions in which we lived. I would not have been able to teach earlier elements of New Humanities program without the resources at New Beacon Books, because there's nobody else who would have a bunch of material to teach with. It was one thing to say, please, black people have lived in the United Kingdom since 1516 is one page from Peter Fryer. It was another to direct somebody to go and study in the absence of a curriculum, in the absence of something called Black Studies, as it were, which is now proliferating at a pace now without the work John LaRose was doing. Okay, so it's the privilege of having lived that time. I hope I'll be able to capture it in my memoir. You know, the pleasures of living through that world is phenomenal. It shaped me. And in Gus's case, his commitment is to education and learning, and what it looks like from that Jesuit style. A kind of a radical possibility. A radical possibility. He's not saying, we must eternalize Bishop, but students must be reminded about, it's not didn't start with Ukraine. Think about what happened to Grenada before we jump in to say X or Y. We might learn something. We might learn something, and is rare in that regard. He knows how institutions work. He never at any point decided that he was going to be a community leader. He's a youth worker, taught in a youth work setting, worked in local government, worked in, the issue with Gus is his occupancy of the sites that he's trying to do and maintain the dignity and humanity and the love for ordinary folk. And I salute him. John was the same. And as figures at some point in that moment in which Race Today is going that way, Black Bookshop is going that way, the Institute is now the cultural studies in the academies, and these are different sites. but they're not. I don't read them as being opposite to one another. They're not. They're complementary. But it's important to understand the distinction within them and the things that they paid attention to.
The CLR James kind of.
CLR is like a godfather to all of them. They, he's the generation. He's a generation before them. It's almost that they are having an intergenerational conversation with CLR. And they inherit bits of CLR in different ways. We might as well say we take, who likes which part of CLR. Depends what afternoon you arrive in Railton Road, like bumping into me and Henry. Do you know what I mean? We're in the shadow of where CLR would have been.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that I think one would do is to, direct young folk to our own intellectual ancestors. Okay? Not to approach them as gods, as it were, but with a certain level of respect. And you'll find they're quarreling with sometimes an earlier version of the stuff that's preoccupying us now. So we're not always in the sort of absolute beginning. There's no such thing as actually an absolute beginning. There are continuities and discontinuities within a particular period of time. And I think it matters to say to black youth, these people around. They are. There is no such thing as understanding race today without delving into darkest how is inconceivable without two being a grandson of the same period. Do you see what I mean? They all take different, like a boys' quarrel, different kinds of questions. But I want young people to just sometimes to think with this, see whether or not they give some answers to what is it that Paul Robeson saw, at the time. What are his disappointments? What is the disappointments of the Communist Party? With all of them, whether it's Richard Wright or Stuart. What is it? What is this? What is it that they read differently? Because they don't denounce Marx. They just simply say, well, yes, he's there, but he's not daddy. He's a neighbor, but he doesn't know how to cook with me. He has a beard, but he's not the son of God. Do you know what I mean? They do actually say it rather wonderfully what their quarrels are. And I think they invite that we read them with that critical acclaim as well. And I think that's important because that's the moment in which we begin to face our new times. Our new times, And our new times, of course, Suella Braverman. I mean, that terrifies me like you have no idea. Because I can't speak about her in the way in which I would have done to whoever it was who occupied that oak space 10 years ago. It's a different body of person. Race is still very present, but it's not chromatic. Okay? I still can't just say it's because we came from the empire, that alone. I'm trying now to say they were already in place. It was an illusion to think conservatism was wired biologically, although at that time we might have thought it was. My neighbors downstairs in the shop I stop, right? They began their life in Uganda. They know every now and again I go to Makerere and come back. My conversation with people in my corner shop is I'm having a conversation with people who were born, whose umbilical cord is on the African continent. And we both share that. I'm just as African as they are. Do you know what I mean? But we are able to do that because we have a sense of our histories. I don't know what political projects they're involved in, for all I know. But sometimes it's one thing that we say hello about. And the owners of my building is a company that is owned by a group of brothers from Mumbai. I've lived in this country a long time to know the experience of different kind of landlords. Believe you me, my interaction with Celtic Holdings is a very different order and experience from the other white landlords I've had in my life. I'm old enough to say that without reservation. Of course, I'm a difficult tenant. There are difficult landlords too, but there are some things that I don't think would be possible without that. It isn't. It's the different. It brings a different remark when my landlord or his manager walks up to come and see me.
Well,
Do you know what I mean?
it's interesting you're talking about Asian landlords because we have the class stratification of the global South diaspora,
right,
which also feeds the Tory right
Yes,
in the forging of
exactly
Suella
right. We
Braverman.
have to go back. That's what I mean. We have to go back. Right. It is its symmetry with a certain kind of rise of the biblical fundamentalist Protestant organization of churches around the globe, of places that used to be. You go to Wood Green. I mean, there is a church around the corner. What is this? Has not dropped from Mars. So this forces us to go back to read. It doesn't force us to do a flight. I'm not going to run away from it. We need to name it. Those are new times. See, that's why the metaphor new times matters, because that's new time. It wasn't there before.
I wanted to pick up on something connected. So, looking back at the histories of our struggles, Claudia Jones is campaigning against the first immigration bill in the early 60s. The campaign against immigration laws is central to our struggle, but it seems to drop off by the 90s. It's not centralized. So what I wanted you to comment on was Brexit. What was your experience and feelings and reflections around the period leading up to Brexit and then
Siva wrote something very beautiful ages ago around Fortress Europe. Really. Brexit really is the culmination of the discussion about Fortress Europe. Right? And in which there is this kind of... I don't think when the Fortress Europe or Brexit period began, these people realized that there were already black folk inside the tent. So it appears on the horizon as in a form of running away of the existence of the likes of you and me, only to discover we're already in there. So that's one way of looking about it. It's a crisis of the end of an identity, right? That's really what I mean. It's a crisis of, it doesn't begin with Brexit. It begins a lot earlier, right? It fulfills, it reaches its apogee around empire. And the problem about that, it's about race. So is the history of immigration. I'm surprised down with the go back to 1906 Aliens Act as an anti-Jewish thing. And the subsequent histories of immigration law in this country for the last 100 years is inseparable from the subject of race.
we've got its parallels in the US and Canada
Just
as
this
well.
country, from 1906, from the Aliens Act to the present, right? An entire century and more is each one in piece has never extracted itself from the story of race. It's built on it. It's built on the purpose of excluding somebody else. And I said, it's no surprise the first one is called the Aliens Act and identify an other in it. There's a process of othering which is central to every single piece of immigration law in this country. Okay. At a time in which planetary, the movement of people is blowing unstoppable. So it instead of thinking about the movement of the history of the movement of people, whether it's driven by war or whatever it might be, okay, is a product of the precarity of our planet. Immigration law is inconceivable. As it exists, it's not so much because they have the United States or Canada or elsewhere. It's simply about excluding somebody else. And in Britain, it's constituted around the question of race. Always has been.
How do you feel Jeremy Corbyn navigated that period?
Well, I think I want to say two things about that period. that it starts a lot earlier. The one thing Jeremy Corbyn was able to do was simply excite people into joining the Labour Party. That's the one thing it achieved by telling them a possibility of a counter story. I don't think it follows from there that it answered my favorite questions, and one of which is immigration. I think all political institutions have kind of fallen into the same rhetoric or kind of populism when it comes to immigration, because the racial animus still runs across political institutions in this country. I don't think. I think the premise begins on the construction of a moral panic that is non-existent, and the human bodies that they think are involved in it, are not the ones that are arriving on the island. They're almost embarrassed that it's actually a Polish blonde person who washes off the scum. They'd rather it was you and me. It would be easier, wouldn't it? Because they try to give us virginity tests at the airport. I mean, who thinks things like that? Just think about, it's not that long ago, Okay? I'm not talking, it's not long ago. Okay? Right? This is in living memory. You can still go down to Southall now and talk to women who were subjected to it. Okay, they're young people trying to, become active in politics, whose mothers were subjected to it, whose grandparents still, were able to come here to be looked after. Still, I'm described as people who can't open a bank account. Okay, the idea that they could continue to learn their own community languages is gone because that education that is promoted that has been disappeared. So I'm not talking. This makes me so angry. I'm not talking about a history gone. I'm talking about real life. Now, there is no difference really between that and the sudden excitement about Windrush. And Windrush is not as isolated as people think. It dominates everybody from the global south. I mean, the stories, you only have to know what it's like to simply try and go and have a weekend in Italy as a black subject. You and me wanting to go and sort of party somewhere. All kinds of things come into play. Most of my white friends, or some of my black friends even, who were born and bred here, don't realize what it is, to sort of, I can't just say, let's meet in Berlin next week for a grand party. I would love to, but there is already, like an exclusion, okay? Now, the very idea that we might want to go to an organizing meeting in Edinburgh, we are assumed to be, we become the subject of what? What is this project radicalization or whatever it is? The very idea of just I want to go run a series of classes at a community center in Hounslow for nothing, so I've got the time. Project radicalism. Okay. It might be, but it isn't. Right? Going to the barber shop, which used to be safe spaces for you to send your boy, and leave him in the barber shop, talking to all this, a granddad, telling him about da. Why are you going to someone says, it's now a dangerous zone because he might be radicalized. I mean, the school is telling him something, you are telling him something, daddy's friends are telling him another. These kids are growing up in an atmosphere of fear. Okay? There used to be all these kids who are really cultured. Now they're the Taliban. How does that? Okay, this is in 1 decade, for God's sake. It makes me angry. That is the story of angry is not good enough. And if political parties don't touch that story, they become increasingly irrelevant to people's lives. And if you go to Ashford, you're going to Heathrow, get off, go to Ashford, a youth establishment place, and on a Wednesday during visiting times, by the time the bus gets there, it's full of black women in tears. The place is like a black youth center of young boys who've been arrested under this thing called joint enterprise. And the figures began to rise at a time in which Starmer was head of CPS, the time in which he's very proud of. Right? we just said the celebration of the Good Friday Agreement. Yes? There are a number of people behind the scene, Mormon and Jerome Corbyn one, who behind the scene, persuaded some through their contacts people to come to the negotiating table. There is no way in which Keir Starmer could go to that conference and say Good Friday Agreement, and at the same time saying in the House of Commons, I used to look up people who used to bomb XYZ. Right? I'm not saying I'm just saying one thing or another, but the optics tell you something completely different. His is not a figure of peace. Okay? So we are stuck with a man who are we really serious that tomorrow can be imagined from somebody who is in the policing sentencing council meetings, out of which sentencing procedures have produced the increase of young black youth in the prison is a good thing? Question. David Lammy, commissioned by Cameron to do an investigation into the criminal justice system. He goes and looks and stuff. He does a report. Most of the studies is based on, people who are inside the system as a result of the sentencing culture, right, in which who is at the head of it? Starmer. Are we to understand that his recommendations to that report was commissioned by Cameron has disappeared? Does it not apply to Starmer? Or does it do? What kind of foreign secretary in the modern with that is history of empire, yes, goes around saying the new alliances of our world must be one that are built on militarism as opposed to peace? Those are very serious questions for us to think about now. There's Brexit being a story really about the crisis of empire, the end of a story, culminating into the reproduction of a right-wing project and the populist. The Trumpification of this country is still going on. I would like to think that the Labour Party will regain the 60 seats that it lost. And the reason it lost was not just because people did not buy what the Labour Party at that moment is suggesting, was because of a coalition of the Conservatives didn't have to do anything. The right of the Labour Party went around telling its own constituencies not to vote for them. Now you think they're going to suddenly want to vote for what? Why? What is it that's on offer alternative to what the Tories are? What would be the point of me encouraging anybody to vote for the Labour Party if all they are going to do is to be a different kind of Sunak? Do you know what I mean? These are deeply felt thoughts. So we are in serious times. We are in new times in that way, that our conversation has to change, that the mode of attack ought to change, the articulation has to be different. We really need to address the material conditions in which people live. You know what? I sound like a copyright. He said most people are living on food banks. We have to think of a politics that attends to those questions. I live in Islington. This place is poor, contrary to the legend. And some of this stuff misguided in educational alliances might have been, it still speaks to the material conditions. The trouble is, it somehow has to find a way of connecting itself to a larger picture, whatever a larger picture might look like.
Could continue on this vein for a second, if you don't mind. I wanted to kind of touch upon two other things in our conversation. Perhaps we can wind it down after that. Was the Irish question and the struggle of the Irish, and also the state of global South politics today, and exploring this concept of what is this multipolar world emerging, right? But just to continue on the Starmer point, there's an argument that says, first of all, Starmer is reproducing a new Labour 2.0, that he's shifting to the right because the British population is to the right. There is no pressure from the left. Power concedes nothing without a demand. There doesn't seem to be a demand that actually exists. So how do we navigate that?
The first thing I think I said it earlier, political parties have an educational function, even if they don't realize it, that they do, and then they should carry it out. What is it that they should educate? They should educate people about the alternative world they would like to see. That seems to me is the problem with the Labour Party, not taking up the gauntlet of an educative function which they already have, not recognizing the ideological, even if they stumble through it during the dark. So it has to reinvent itself around those two fronts. One.
But
I'm still going. The second thing is this, and this is more crucial. In the neoliberalism is produced in this little island. This is the fountainhead of it. Okay? Which it then exports internationally. Right. So that what we have to do is to think about what neoliberalism is doing, not just a sort of fad, how it has interfered in every single aspect of life, right? So that people can then buy into an alternative to it. What Starmer does, he says, you can live with it, right? This is not new Labour with steroids. The interesting thing about Tony Blair is that he won the argument with Clause 4. He took the membership with him. Okay? This is Stalin. Right? There will be no conversation if you have one, you'll be punished. This is different. Okay? You could predict what double shuffle Tony Blair was going to do. I really don't know. I know I read things. I don't know. And it's 2/3 of a way it's before an election. Can I right now say to you, the Labour Party is likely to look like this? It doesn't know what it's opposed to anymore, if it ever did have one. Right? It doesn't. Nobody. Okay, there's a housing bill that's going on at the moment. Nobody in the Labour Party is talking about revisiting the Housing Act with the purpose of reimagining rent hikes so that there's this proper security of tenure and control on the whims of rising rents, in which is instrumental in driving young people from doing anything. Nobody. He says he'll do something when he's in power. The question is what? The police bill is people just been arrested for wanting to go and say hello to Charlie when he was getting married, including monarchists. He is not indicating whether or not he's going to repeal it. We've had a whole year of industrial action from a range of public sector. The Labour Party institutionally is nowhere to be seen about that. Every single town, every single borough will talk about food banks and cost of living crisis. There isn't a strategy about what is going to be done about that. Okay? Every avenue of political life that one could stitch together and say, give us power, we might do this. You can't just say, give me power, and not tell me what you're going to do with it. I want to be able to give you my support responsibly. I'm an active human being. Okay. The people will end up and say, well, at least we know what the Tories are going to do. Because their map is laid out. And always the Labour Party the alternative seems to be saying is that, well, they're not nice, we'll manage it differently. I mean, how does a politician get away with making remarks that says, oh, there's no such thing as food banks. People are just having a cash flow crisis. And it's normal. The normalization of misery in that way. Okay. And the urgent question about, I can't imagine what it must be like to wake up every morning in the West Bank or in Gaza. Never mind Tel Aviv itself. And constitute ourselves as people of the next century, 50 years, with that staring us in our face and saying, actually, we can't discuss this. And to discuss this might end up being, and live in a world in which the most difficult questions of the day are also denied the space to discuss them. And I'm surprised that if you take young people out of the parliamentary debate, you end up with bombings on the street. That's the seriousness of this. Questions of learning from the South. I want to select bits, right? Which say, well, what is it that we might, certainly one about the movement of people, might enable us to unlock the question of migration, right? The question of the precarity of the African continent might enable us to think about the question of climate change. The question of the Indian Ocean might enable us to think about how we might reconfigure how we live together. You know, there are ways in which we can imaginatively think about being on the planet. That's the second. The third one, which is to do with well, I've touched on immigration, I've touched on reimagining. It's to do with where next. Where next depends on enabling, facing up to the what I see as the continuous Trumpification of this island. Why do I revoke to Trump? The populism that that still makes Boris Johnson appear sexy politician haven't gone away. He might not, but he still does, right? He still is the subject through which people think of themselves in the Tory party. By diversion, Liz Truss and Kwate, okay. For most people on the right, I don't think they understood him. In fact, both political parties think that there is a problem with the Treasury. Right? The question is what you do with it. Right? Liz Truss and Kwate thought they could deal with it by sugaring the cake of the right. They made it too obvious. Right? The other lot thought, no, leave it. Okay? Give it a free will, free reign, as long as we just don't tell the secrets about who gets money. Do you know what I mean? So both sides have a problem with the Treasury. Okay. It's never been because the Labour Party or anybody else hadn't costed their budget. The question is, how does that language of costing the budget, costing the spending, come from? Okay. What does it bring with it? It is an effect, a clitoral effect on the political imaginary. People think, oh my God, how much money did the government suddenly find, both to deal with COVID and Ukraine, when at the same time refusing to give old people free buses? It is possible to get people out of this quagmire by simply making commitment of the stuff that there is. It requires that is radical imaginary. That is the kind of purpose of what an alternative will look like. An imaginary. It is a key word. We can imagine another world being possible in which we live together. Right? Not in them versus us, in which we live together. Now, I know it sounds very simple, but it's also very complicated, because how you arrive there is if the North, the archive of knowledge, has given us this, let's let it go. Let's go somewhere else. That's what makes learning from the South exciting as a alternative. Now, neoliberalism in Latin America no longer means what it used to do when it was opened up. One of the things we were able to do was to say, enough of the Bretton Woods, the enslaving economies, right? The rearrangement of who's going to be the president of what country of the 54 countries that make up African continent is made alive, permissible, as long as that Bretton Woods, IMF superstructure remains in place. And the whole sanctioning of the world, predominance of the dollar, and all of that is part and parcel of the same story. And BRICS suggests that that's what to break away from. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be easy.
So it's interesting you're partially centralizing, and I would, agree with that, the centralization of the politics of migration.
Mm-hmm.
Taking that and going into this new multipolar world, the BRICS, the global south, what are your hopes or your disappointments at the moment? Because just to problematize this a little bit.
I was going to say jump in there and say to you, one of my biggest disappointments is why when we South Africa has now got the most draconian immigration laws on the continent.
They're very depressing. It's shocking, it's depressing, it's disappointing.
We're being kind when we're saying that.
No,
they are
thanks.
horrible.
Horrific.
Okay?
Yeah.
And it's almost impossible to imagine how on earth did it happen in the light of what produced us to get there. I had hoped, okay, which is what it is I was involved in, that, South Africa could become the model, whatever the post-race or thinking outside race could look like. It did indeed the opposite. How did it become a trade union of thieves or something? Okay, and in which racism's xenophobia, MAD 15 is become part and parcel of everyday politics. Now that demands us to look again, because here is a structure that on one hand has a commitment on paper to allow free movement of people within the region, and yet at the same time, okay, the treatment of non-South Africans, be they Zimbabwean, you see, the West encouraged a lot of people to think that there were millions and millions of people from Zimbabwe who were leaving Zimbabwe because of Robert Mugabe, only to discover, actually, in the paperwork, really no, these families were people who were already connected to one another. Right? What you have in Southern Africa is the movement of families speaking different languages. In fact, that is the story of the global South. Right? I'm getting there. So it is important then to try and identify. I'm not saying everything from the global South geographically is hunky-dory. I want to think of a concept of the global South which is not necessarily geographical. Do you see what I mean? Which allows me to think bottom up, which allows me to imagine as an artist person, to imagine a different installation in which Reunion Island is the center of the world, not this little island in the northeast of the world, which has given miseries to everyone. Yes?
When you come to the migration routes, the
Right.
Eastern African migration route,
Mm-hmm.
the North African migration route, the Latin American migration route, in which there's Asians and Africans traversing as well through the Darien Gap and all of that mess.
Yes.
There's no leadership on this issue.
Well, no, I don't think. I think I want to say to a generation younger than me, each generation produces its own leadership. You produce your own leadership, okay? Not me to tell you what it should be like, okay? We produced our own at a time in which it was necessary. It has outlived its purpose. I'm not Methuselah, okay? But I do think you need to produce your own, which are responsive to material conditions in which you live the future. I want to put a strong emphasis on that. You also need to have a set of ideas that you think with. That's why it matters to reanimate your grandparents intellectually, where they are. Even in thinking through the quarrels you have with them, you might find something anew. That's where new times takes you. Now, I don't think these things that just happened by themselves. Sometimes the conception of a leadership is misleading. There's something weird about that. So I want to put it aside for a moment. Not because it's not important, but I don't want to give it center stage that it occupies. It's a getaway. It imagines a fully polished person from Planet 16 arriving in my little abode as the leader. Shoot me if you ever find me being like that. I've told some fellow Zimbabweans, right? That is I had to get out of this country to go to Norway to become a professor. I mean, they wouldn't give it to me, right? So, but if you see a leaflet says, vote Professor George Shire in the middle of Zimbabwe. I give you permission to shoot me because I'm not in the seminar room. In other words, I'm trying to argue with the way the proliferation of the Berlin Conference in the academy. There are lots of us out like that. We're just doing musical chairs in the academy, in the citadel. Forget it. Wipe it out. Get rid of it. Let's go back to the drawing board and think through what is it that's left with the spirit of Bandung. What is it that I find seductive by calling myself a Bandungist? You know, is what I'm getting at. I'm giving it out as a freebie. You know, become a Bandungist for a day and imagine what it does to your brain. It might do some good things. It might also do some terrible things. You know what I mean? I want us to reimagine with those ideas that have sustained Black life for centuries, the ones that the so-called Enlightenment Project tried to destroy. And the figuration of the Indian Ocean is useful for me in that way because it's got two bits operating at the same time. It's got trade, independent individual trade, and slavery operating at the same time. There is a relationships of trade by tracing food that crosses from the Indian Ocean to what I call the African Ocean. To some people, they don't understand what I mean, but it's right there. Okay, it's right there. If there was no forensic science knowledge, how on earth did those guys who now remain nameless be able to bring David Livingstone's body from the north of the Zanzibar to Scotland? You know, how did they travel? How did they? This guy dies, they mount his body, they decide to go on a boat, to travel by boat, try to come to London, go to they give him a decent burial, and suddenly they don't even have a name. Did someone remembers them as, whoa, how did they disappear from history? That's the work. That just paying attention to that gives us a narrative that says forensic history was present. The question becomes the politics about disappearing that story. Equally, if I'm walking through a cemetery in, say, which I've done in, say, Stoke Newington, that one, sometimes you pass across this so-and-so Sierra Leone lawyer, okay, living through the exact same period as the Berlin Conference was going on. I don't buy that Sierra Leone lawyer was a single person. There would have been other scholars from the empire, so-called, who were around. They would have, like you and I do today, had said something about resistance to the conference. Right? The work of art is to reimagine, reenact their existence, and do a work. Or accept that they just were garden boys and so on. And what they've produced are the Berlin Conference in the academy. And a lot of African scholarship is the product of what I call Berlin Conference in the academy. Certainly on Zimbabwe. Now, in South Africa, imagine there are 365 days of the year. 115 of those days, there is no power, electricity at all. A third of the year. Imagine a third of the year without electricity. Nobody knows about it at all. There is difficulty getting on the on internet in Zimbabwe for an afternoon. You get people want to go and march at the United Nations. What is that about? These things are not from... Rupert Murdoch is not just something of an English disease. There is a kind of a Rupert Murdoch in the global south too, eating itself away. Let's not assume it's absent. That matters. But I think the language and the point of reference to it, for me, is different. So yes, I see a re-emergence of something new, but I don't want us to be blind to what it might be. I think we need to have a theory of institutions. I think we need to have a vested an articulation of the world in which we want to be. And I think we need to be part of the planetary politics. That's one of the things I like about Paul Giro's work. To us imagine a planetary planetary conditions in which we're trying to think our conditions. And immediately when I say that, a number of fellow scholars emerge who are struggling to make that possible. From Rosie Braidotti to Paul Giro, Achille Mbembe to Mdimbe, Gunga Tiongo Orego, Mamdani to Guy Spivak, Stuart Siva. You know, we have loads of them that we need to reanimate ourselves in reading. Maybe we need to go back to reading groups again to just grapple with ideas about how to carry on in this very, very difficult time. And yeah, in that sense, I would say a luta continua.